welcome back. It's Christina, the manager of the PB Library, and it is day 28 of our read-along together of The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. If this was February and not a leap year, then we would have had a whole month worth of reading. But it is not February, and I think it was a leap year, so we're still under a month of reading. So, today we have 2 chapters ahead of us. We also had 2 chapters yesterday. We're going to go ahead and start with a lovely tea, as usual. Today I've got a loose leaf black tea. It is specifically the Earl Grey de la Crème. Really nice. It has a lovely vanilla scent to it, as well as the Earl Grey flavor, so like with the bergamot. I love this one. It just has a really, like a gentle sweetness to it, too. Hi, Helen. Good to see you. Okay, so let's go in and enjoy our story. We'll start by recapping a little of what happened yesterday. Yesterday was kind of interesting. I feel like it was sort of setting the scene for what's going to come later on. We read 2 chapters, chapters 46 and 47. In 46, Unlimited Credit, the Count of Monte Cristo met up again with Baron Danglars. You might remember, long ago in the beginning of our story, Danglars had worked on the same ship with Edmond Dantes, both for Monsieur Morel, and Danglars was the one who had written the letter denouncing falsely Edmond Dantes as a Bonapartist. That same letter was then picked up by Fernand and delivered to the authorities. And so in this meeting, Danglars is questioning a letter which he has received from the Roman bankers. I think it was Thompson and French. And these Roman bankers had said that the Count of Monte Cristo should be granted unlimited credit. And he was saying, well, there really is not such a thing like that. You know, and how much are you asking for? And Monte Cristo says basically, well, what do you mean? Unlimited means unlimited. It's, you know, it's like, if you don't want to do business with me, if you can't afford to do business with me, then I will go to these other bankers with whom I also have letters written for unlimited credit. And he then shows the Baron Danglars these letters, and Danglars is both worried about losing face, being thought that he can't meet the financial needs of the Count of Monte Cristo, but also, more than that, he's thinking that this business is going to go to some other rival banker, and he wants that business. Especially after the Count of Monte Cristo just cavalierly says, oh yes, I'm going to be in town for about 1 year. I shouldn't spend more than 6 million pounds. And the Baron Danglars is stunned and amazed at the idea that a man would spend that much money in 1 year. And therefore, of course, he wants to be his banker because he wants to have access to those funds and the wealth of the Count of Monte Cristo. So they agree to do business with each other. Meanwhile, so there were actually 2 brief sort of meetings with the Baron Danglars in that first chapter. Originally he came to the Count's house on the Champs-Élysées. The Count refused to see him, and then later on the Count went and saw Baron Danglars at his place. After that first brief encounter where the Baron came to the Count of Monte Cristo's house and the Count didn't see him, as he was leaving, the Count made a big deal of saying to his steward, Bertuccio, those are very nice horses that he has. In fact, they look as good as my horses, and I told you I wanted the best horses in France. And the steward's like, well, yeah, I got you the best I could. And he's like, I want those too. And so the steward then is tasked with going out to purchase those horses at whatever price is needed. This comes back because afterwards, when the Baron goes to introduce the Count of Monte Cristo, with whom he's now agreed to do business, in the second chapter that we read, The Dappled Greys, the Baron introduces the Count to his wife. And we get the feeling that the Baron and his wife are not very happily married. She sort of looks down on her husband. She was of better birth than he was. And she realizes that she's told by her maid that her horses are missing from the stables. And her husband tries to make us some story about, oh, your horses are really too wild. They're not quite tame enough for you. I worry about you. I got rid of them so you wouldn't be burdened with those horses. Really, he sold them to the Count of Monte Cristo, not realizing it was to him. He just knew some crazy person had said he wanted to buy these horses for an exorbitant amount of money, and he couldn't resist the offer. The Count then says, bring out my horses. And when her friend, Monsieur Debray, sees those horses, he's like, oh my good Baroness, those are your horses, aren't they? she's very upset. The Count then, to assuage the situation, says, I would never want to upset a beautiful woman like yourself. Let me give you back these horses. And so he gives back the horses that he had purchased, but he gives them back as a gift. So again, Baron Danglars gets to keep that money. He also outfits each horse with a beautiful diamond in its on its livery. No, that's not the word. On its tack. And so the horses come back not just, the gift of them, but also with the diamonds, and they're all quite stunned and amazed at this generosity. Madame Danglars, meanwhile, had said that the horses were going to be borrowed the next day by a friend of hers, Mrs. Villefort, Madame Villefort. And so what the Count does then is he goes back to his country home, the one in Auteuil, and he says to his servant Ali, I believe you said you know how to lasso animals. You used to do this back before you came here. And have you actually lassoed a lion? Why, yes, I have. And it's like, okay, then maybe you could lasso a horse for me. And so, in no surprise to the Count, the horses then, a while later, they come madly dashing down the lane by his house. In the carriage that is carrying Madame de Villefort and her young son, those horses have quite gone wild, and they're running amok. And they're, the passengers inside the carriage are very frightened. And Ali, of course, brings out his lasso. He's ready. He's waiting. He lassos the legs of the first horse. The horse goes down, stops the carriage, and the Count of Monte Cristo comes down and saves Madame de Villefort and her son. And the two of them are very, very grateful. And she ends by the chapter ends with her writing a letter to Madame Danglars saying, this Count of Monte Cristo, you'd said he'd given you these horses. I thought it was kind of like almost too good to be true and kind of crazy what you were saying. It was almost too fabulous. And now I've met the man, and he's exactly as fabulous as you said. And in fact, maybe you didn't even give enough credit. He's the best guy ever. Wow. So everyone's falling in love with the Count of Monte Cristo right now. And she ends up by saying, too, that I really want to see him again, and I'm sure my husband will soon go visit the Count of Monte Cristo. And so that's where we take up today with Monsieur de Villefort going to visit the Count of Monte Cristo. And by the way, again, there's slight differences between the version that we're reading, the one that was published by Routledge and Sons in 1888, that translation, versus the one that I've been referring to also occasionally, the Everyman Library Edition print. What I thought was kind of interesting was in the one that I'm actually reading to you, the text, which is from the online edition, which I'm getting through Project Gutenberg, and if you want to read along with me, the Project Gutenberg edition says that it was originally published in 5 volumes. So today, with chapter 48, we are commencing to begin the 3rd volume of our 5-volume edition of the Count of Monte Cristo. So let's go ahead and start with volume 3, chapter 48, Ideology. If the Count of Monte Cristo had been for a long time familiar with the ways of Parisian society, he would have appreciated better the significance of the step which Monsieur de Villefort had taken. Standing well at court, whether the king regnant was of the older or younger branch, whether the government was doctrinaire liberal or conservative, looked upon by all as a man of talent, since those who have never experienced a political check are generally so regarded. Hated by many, but warmly supported by others, without being really liked by anybody, Monsieur de Villefort held a high position in the magistracy, and maintained his eminence like a Harlay or a Molay. His drawing-room, under the regenerating influence of a young wife and a daughter by his first marriage, scarcely 18, was still one of the well-regulated Paris salons where the worship of traditional customs and the observance of rigid etiquette were carefully maintained. A freezing politeness, a strict fidelity to government principles, a profound contempt for theories and theorists, a deep-seated hatred of ideality, these were the elements of private and public life displayed by Monsieur de Villefort. Monsieur de Villefort was not only a magistrate, he was also a diplomatist. His relations with the former court, of which he always spoke with dignity and respect, made him respected by the new one, and he knew so many things that not only was he always carefully considered, but sometimes consulted. Perhaps this would not have been so had it been possible to get rid of Monsieur de Villefort. But like the feudal barons who rebelled against their sovereign, he dwelt in an impregnable fortress. This fortress was his post as king's attorney, all the advantages of which he exploited with marvelous skill, in which he would not have resigned but to be made deputy, and thus to replace neutrality by opposition. Ordinarily, Monsieur de Villefort made and returned very few visits. His wife visited for him, and this was the received thing in the world, where the weighty and multifarious occupations of the magistrate were accepted as an excuse for what was really only calculated pride, a manifestation of professed superiority. In fact, the application of the axiom, pretend to think well of yourself, and the world will think well of you. An axiom 100 times more useful in society nowadays than that of the Greeks. Know thyself, a knowledge for which our race gives substituted less difficult, more advantageous science of knowing others. To his friends, Monsieur de Villefort was a powerful protector. To his enemies, he was a silent but bitter opponent. For those who were neither the one nor the other, he was a statue of the law made man. He had a haughty bearing, a look either steady and impenetrable or insolently piercing and inquisitorial. 4 successive revolutions had built and cemented the pedestal upon which his fortune was based. Monsieur de Villefort had the reputation of being the least curious and the least wearisome man in France. He gave a ball every year, at which he appeared for a quarter of an hour only, that is to say, 45 minutes less than the king is visible at his balls. He was never seen at the theaters, at concerts, or in any place of public resort. Occasionally, seldom, he played at whist, and then care was taken to select partners worthy of him. Sometimes were masters, sometimes archbishops, sometimes prince or peasant, sometimes duchess. Such was the magistrate had just now stopped before the Count of Monte Cristo's door. The valet de chambre announced Monsieur de Villefort at the moment when the Count, leaning over a large table, was tracing on a map the route from St. Petersburg to China. The procureur entered with the same grave and measured step he would have employed in entering court of justice. He was the same man, or rather, the development of the same man, whom we have heretofore seen as assistant attorney at Marseilles. Nature, according to her way, had made no deviation in the path he marked out for himself. From being slender, he had now become meager. Once pale, he was now yellow. His deep-set eyes were hollow, and the gold spectacles shielding his eyes seemed to be an integral portion of his face. He dressed entirely in black, with the exception of his white tie, and his funeral appearance was only mitigated by the slight line of red ribbon which passed almost imperceptibly through his buttonhole, and appeared like a streak of blood traced with a delicate brush. All the master himself, Monte Cristo, scrutinized with irrepressible curiosity the magistrate, whose salute he returned, and whose distrustful habit, and especially incredulous as to social prodigies, was much despised to look upon the noble stranger, as Monte Cristo was already called, as an adventurer in search of new fields, or an escaped criminal, rather than as a prince of the Holy See, or a sultan of the 1,001 Nights. Sir, said Villefort, in the sweet tone assumed by magistrates in their oratorial periods, and which they cannot or will not divest themselves in society, sir, the signal service which you yesterday rendered to my wife and son has made it a duty for me to offer you my thanks. I have come, therefore, to discharge this duty, and to express to you my overwhelming gratitude. And as he said this, the eye severe of the magistrate had lost nothing of its habitual arrogance. He spoke in a voice of the procureur general, with the rigid inflexibility of neck and shoulders, which caused his flatterers to say, as we have before observed, that he was the living statue of the law. Monsieur, replied the twinkling heir, I am very happy to have been the means of preserving a son his mother, for they say the sentiment of maternity is the most holy of all, and the good fortune should occur to me, monsieur, might have enabled you to dispense with the duty which, in its discharge, confers an undoubtedly great honor. For I am aware that Monsieur de Villefort is not usually lavish of the favor which he now bestows on me, a favor which, however estimable, is unequal to the satisfaction which I have in my own consciousness. Villefort, astonished at this reply, which he by no means expected, started like a soldier who feels the blow leveled at him over the armor he wears. And a curl of his disdainful lip indicated that from that moment he noted in the talents of his brain that the Count of Monte Cristo was by no means a highly bred gentleman. He glanced around in order to seize on something on which the conversation might turn, and seemed to fall easily on a topic. He saw a map which Monte Cristo had been examined when he entered, and said, You seem geographically engaged, sir. It is a rich study for you, who, as I learn, have seen as many lands as are delineated on this map. Yes, sir, replied Count. I sought to make the human race take in the mass what you practice every day on individuals, a physiological study. I have believed it was much easier to ascend from the whole to a part than to ascend from a part to the whole. It is a trick axiom, makes us proceed from a known to an unknown quantity, and not from an unknown to a known. But sit down, sir, I beg of you. Monte Cristo pointed to a chair, which the procureur was obliged to take the trouble to move forwards himself, while the Count merely fell back in his own, on which he had been kneeling when Monsieur Villefort entered. Thus the Count was halfway turned towards his visitor, having his back towards the window, his elbow resting on the geographical chart which furnished the theme of conversation for the moment, a conversation which assumed, as in the case of the interviews of Danglars and Morcerf, a turn analogous to persons, if not to the situation. Ah, you philosophize, replied Villefort, after a moment's silence, during which the wrestler who encounters a powerful opponent, he took breath. Well, sir, really, if, like you, I had nothing else to do, I should seek a more amusing occupation. Why, in truth, sir, was Monte Cristo's reply, man is but an ugly caterpillar for him who studies him through a solar microscope. But you said, I think, that I had nothing else to do. Now, really, let me ask, sir, have you? Do you believe you have anything to do? Or speak in plain terms, do you think that what you do deserves being called anything? Villefort's astonishment redoubled at this second thrust, so forcibly made by his strange adversary. It was a long time since the magistrate had heard a paradox so strong, or rather, to say the truth more exactly, it was the first time he had ever heard of it. The cure exerted himself to reply. Sir, he responded, you are a stranger, and I believe you see yourself that a portion of your life has been spent in the Oriental countries, so you are not aware how human justice, so expeditious and barbarous countries, takes with us a prudent and well-studied course. Oh yes. Yes, I do, sir. It is the pecado of the ancients. I know all that, for it is with justice of all countries especially that I have occupied myself. It is with the criminal procedure of all nations that I have compared natural justice. And I must say, sir, that it is the law of primitive nations, that is, the law of retaliation, that I have most frequently found to be according to the law of God. If this law were adopted, sir, said Procureur, it would greatly simplify our legal codes. In that case, the magistrate would not, as you just observed, have much to do. It may perhaps come to this in time, observed Monte Cristo. You know that human inventions march from the complex to the simple, and simplicity is always perfection. In the meantime, continued magistrate, our codes are in full force, with all their contradictory enactments derived from Gallic customs, Roman laws, and Frank usages. The knowledge of all which, you will agree, is not to be acquired without extended labor. It needs tedious study to acquire this knowledge, and when acquired, a strong power of brain to retain it. I agree with you entirely, sir, but all that even you know with respect to the French code, I know, not only in reference to that code, but as regards the codes of all nations. English, Turkish, Japanese, Hindu laws are as familiar to me as the French laws, and thus I was right when I said to you that relatively, you know that everything is relative, sir. That relatively to what I have done, you have very little to do, but that relatively to all I have learned, you have yet a great deal to learn. But with what motive have you learned all this? Inquired Villefort in astonishment. Monte Cristo smiled. Really, sir, he observed, I see that in spite of the reputation which you acquired as a superior man, you look at everything from the material and vulgar view of society, beginning with man and ending with man. That is to say, in the most restricted, most narrow view which is possible for human understanding to embrace. Please, sir, explain yourself, said Villefort, more and more astonished. I really do not understand you perfectly. I say, sir, that with the eyes fixed on the social organization of nations, you see only the springs of the machine, and lose sight of the sublime workman who makes them act. I say that you do not recognize before you and around you any but those office holders whose commissions have been signed by minister or king, and that the men whom God has put above those office holders, ministers, and kings by giving them a mission to follow out, instead of a post to fill. I say that they escape your narrow, limited field of observation. It is thus that human weakness fails, from its debilitated and imperfect organs. Tobias took the angel who restored him to light for an ordinary young man. The nations took Attila, who was doomed to destroy them, for a conqueror similar to other conquerors, and it was necessary for both to reveal their missions, that they might be known and acknowledged. One was compelled to say, I am the angel of the Lord, and the other, I am the hammer of God, in order that the divine essence in both might be revealed. Then, said Villefort, more and more amazed, and really supposing he was speaking to a mystic or a madman, you consider yourself as one of those extraordinary beings whom you have mentioned? And why not? Said Monte Cristo coldly. Your pardon, sir, replied Villefort, quite astounded, but you will excuse me if, when I presented myself to you, I was unaware that I should meet with the person whose knowledge and understanding so far surpass the usual knowledge and understanding of men. It is not usual with us corrupted wretches of civilization to find gentlemen like yourself, possessors as you are of immense fortune, at least so it is said. And I beg you to observe that I do not inquire, I merely repeat. It is not usual, I say, for such privileged and wealthy beings to waste their time in speculations on the state of society, in philosophical reveries intended at best to console those whom fate has disinherited from the goods of this world. Really, sir, retorted the Count, have you attained the eminent situation in which you are without having admitted, or even without having met with exceptions? And do you never use your eyes, which must have acquired so much finesse and certainty, to divine at a glance the kind of man by whom you are confronted? Should not a magistrate be not merely the best administrator of the law, but the most crafty expounder of the chicanery of his profession? A steel probe to search hearts, a touchstone to try the gold which in each soul is mingled with more or less of alloy? Sir, said Villefort, upon my word, you overcome me. I really never heard a person speak as you do. Because you remain eternally encircled in a round of general conditions, and have never dared to raise your wings into those upper spheres which God has peopled with invisible or exceptional beings. And you allow then, sir, that spheres exist, and that these marked and invisible beings mingle amongst us? Why should they not? Can you see the air you breathe? and yet without which you could not for a moment exist? Then we do not see those beings to whom you allude? Yes, we do. You see them whenever God pleases to allow them to assume a material form. You touch them, come in contact with them, speak to them, and they reply to you. Ah, said Villefort, smiling, I confess I should like to be warned when one of these beings is in contact with me. You have been served as you desire, monsieur, for you were warned just now, and I now again warn you. Then you yourself are one of these marked beings? Yes, monsieur, I believe so, for until now no man has found himself in a position similar to mine. The dominions of kings are limited either by mountains or rivers, or a change of manners, or an alteration of language. My kingdom is bounded only by the world, for I am not an Italian, or a Frenchman, or a Hindu, or an American, or a Spaniard. I am a cosmopolite. No country can say it saw my birth. God alone knows what country will see me die. I adopt all customs, speak all languages. You believe me to be a Frenchman, for I speak French with the same facility and purity as yourself. Well, Ali, my Nubian, believes me to be an Arab. Bertuccio, my steward, takes me for a Roman. Aide, my slave, thinks me a Greek. You may therefore comprehend that being of no country, asking no protection from any government, acknowledging no man as my brother, not one of the scruples that arrest the powerful or the obstacles which paralyze the weak, paralyzes or arrests me. I have only two adversaries, I will not say two conquerors, for with perseverance I subdue even them. They are time and distance. There is a third, and the most terrible. That is my condition as a mortal being. This alone can stop me in my onward career before I have obtained the goal of which I aim, for all the rest I have reduced to mathematical terms. What men call the chances of fate, namely ruin, change, circumstances, I have fully anticipated, and if any of these should overtake me, yet it will not overwhelm me. Unless I die, I shall always be what I am, and therefore it is that I utter the things you have never heard, even from the mouths of kings. For kings have need, and other persons have fear of you. For who is there who does not say to himself, in a society as incongruously organized as ours, perhaps some day I shall have to do with the king's attorney? But can you not say that, sir? The moment you become an inhabitant of France, you are naturally subjected to the French law. I know it, sir, replied Monte Cristo, but when I visit a country I begin to study, by all the means which are available, the men from whom I may have anything to hope or to fear, till I know them as well as, perhaps better than, they know themselves. It follows from this that the king's attorney, be he who he may, with whom I should have to deal, would assuredly be more embarrassed than I should. That is to say, replied Villefort with hesitation, that human nature being weak, every man, according to your creed, has committed faults. Faults or crimes, responded Monte Cristo with a negligent air, and that you alone, amongst the men whom you do not recognize as your brothers, for you have said so, observed Villefort in a tone that faltered somewhat, you alone are perfect. No, not perfect, was the Count's reply. Only impenetrable, that's all. But let us leave off this strain, sir, if the tone of it is displeasing to you. I am no more disturbed by your justice than you are by my second sight. No, by no means, said Villefort, who was afraid of seeming to abandon his ground. No, by your brilliant and almost sublime conversation, you have elevated me above the ordinary level. We no longer talk, we rise to dissertation. But you know how the theologians in their collegiate chairs, and philosophers in their controversies, occasionally say cruel truths. Let us suppose for the moment that we are theologizing in a social way, or even philosophically, and I will say to you, rude as it may seem, my brother, you sacrifice greatly to pride. I may be above others, but above you there is God. Above us all, sir, was Monte Cristo's response, in a tone and with an emphasis so deep that Villefort involuntarily shuddered. I have my pride for men, serpents always ready to threaten everyone who would pass without crushing them underfoot. But I lay aside that pride before God, who has taken me from nothing to make me what I am." "Then, Count, I admire you," said Villefort, who for the first time in this strange conversation used the aristocratic form to the unknown personage, whom until now he had only called Monsieur. "Yes, and I say to you, if you are really strong, really superior, really pious or impenetrable, then you are right in saying amounts to the same thing. Then be proud, sir, for that is the characteristic of predominance. Yet you have unquestionably some ambition." "I have, sir." "And what may it be?" "I, too, as happens to every man once in his life, have been taken by Satan into the highest mountain in the earth, and when there he showed me all the kingdoms in the world, and as he said before, so said he to me, 'Child of earth, what wouldest thou have to make thee adore me?' I reflected long, for a gnawing ambition had long preyed upon me, and then I replied, 'Listen, I have always heard of Providence, and yet I have never seen him, or anything that resembles him, or which can make me believe that he exists. I wish to be Providence myself, for I feel that the most beautiful, noblest, most sublime thing in the world is to recompense and punish." Satan bowed his head and groaned. "You mistake," he said. "Providence does exist, only you have never seen him, because the child of God is as invisible as the parent. You have seen nothing that resembles him, because he works by secret springs and moves by hidden ways. All I can do for you is to make you one of the agents of that providence." The bargain was concluded. "I may sacrifice my soul, but what matters it?" added Monte Cristo. "If the thing were to do again, I would again do it." Villefort looked at Monte Cristo with extreme amazement. "Count," he inquired, "have you any relations?" "No, sir. I am alone in the world." "So much the worse." "Why?" asked Monte Cristo. "Because then you might witness a spectacle calculated to break down your pride. You say you fear nothing but death?" "I did not say that I feared it. I only said that death alone could check the execution of my plans." "And old age?" "My end will be achieved before I grow old." "And madness?" "I have been nearly mad, and you know the axiom, non bis in idem. It is an axiom of criminal law, and consequently you understand its full application." "Sir," continued Villefort, "there is something to fear besides death, old age, and madness. For instance, there's apoplexy, that lightning stroke which strikes but does not destroy you, and yet which brings everything to an end. You are still yourself as now, and yet you are yourself no longer. You, who, like Ariel, verge on the angelic, are but an inert mass, which, like Caliban, verges on the brutal. And this is called in human tongues, as I tell you, neither more nor less than apoplexy. Come, if you will, Count, and continue this conversation at my house. Any day you may be willing to see an adversary capable of understanding and anxious to refute you, and I will show you my father, Monsieur Noirtier de Villefort, one of the most fiery Jacobins of the French Revolution. That is to say, he had the most remarkable audacity, seconded by a most powerful organization. A man who has not, perhaps, like yourself, seen all the kingdoms of the earth, but who has himself, but who has helped to overturn one of the greatest. In fact, a man who believed himself, like you, one of the envoys, not of God, but of a supreme being, not of Providence, but of fate. Well, sir, the rupture of a blood vessel on the lobe of the brain has destroyed all this, not in a day, not in an hour, but in a second. Monsieur Noirtier, who on the previous night was the old Jacobin, the old senator, the old Carbonaro, laughing at the guillotine, the cannon, and the dagger, Monsieur Noirtier, playing with revolutions, Monsieur Noirtier, for whom France was a vast chessboard from which pawns, rooks, knights, and queens were to disappear, so that the king was checkmated. Monsieur Noirtier, the redoubtable, was the next morning poor Monsieur Noirtier. the helpless old man at the tender mercies of the weakest creature in the household, that is, his grandchild, Valentine, a dumb and frozen carcass, in fact, living painlessly on, that time may be given for his frame to decompose without his consciousness of its decay. Alas, sir, said Monte Cristo, this spectacle is neither strange to my eye nor my thought. I am something of a physician, and have, like my fellows, sought more than once for the soul in living and in dead matter. Yet, like Providence, it has remained invisible to my eyes, although present to my heart. 100 writers since Socrates, Seneca, St. Augustine, and Gall have made, in verse and prose, the comparison you have made, and yet I can well understand that a father's sufferings may effect great changes in the mind of a son. I will call on you, sir, since you bid me contemplate, for the advantage of my pride, this terrible spectacle which must have been so great a source of sorrow to your family. It would have been so unquestionably, had not God given me so large a compensation. In contrast with the old man, who is dragging his way to the tomb, are 2 children just entering into life, Valentine, the daughter of my first wife, Mademoiselle Renée de Saint-Méran, and Edward, the boy whose life you have this day saved. And what is your deduction from this compensation, sir? Inquired Monte Cristo. My deduction is, replied Villefort, that my father, led away by his passions, has committed some fault unknown to human justice, but marked by the justice of God. That God, desirous in his mercy to punish but one person, has visited this justice on him alone. Monte Cristo, with a smile on his lips, uttered in the depths of his soul a groan which would have made Villefort fly had he but heard it. Adieu, sir, said the magistrate who had risen from his seat. I leave you, bearing a remembrance of you, a remembrance of esteem, which I hope will not be disagreeable to you when you know me better, for I am not a man to bore my friends, as you will learn. Besides, you have made an eternal friend of Madame de Villefort. The Count bowed and contented himself with seeing Villefort to the door of his cabinet, the procureur being escorted to his carriage by 2 footmen, who, on a signal from their master, followed him with every mark of attention. When he had gone, Monte Cristo breathed a profound sigh and said, Enough of this poison. Let me now seek the antidote. Then sounding his bell, he said to Ali, who entered, I am going to Madame's chamber. Have the carriage ready at 1 o'clock. And now, chapter 49, Haydée. It will be recollected that the new, or rather old acquaintances of the Count of Monte Cristo, residing in the Rue Meslay, were no other than Maximilian, Julie, and Emmanuel. The very anticipations of delight to be enjoyed in his forthcoming visits, the bright, pure gleam of heavenly happiness it diffused over the almost deadly warfare in which he had voluntarily engaged, illumined his whole countenance with a look of ineffable joy and calmness, as, immediately after Villefort's departure, his thoughts flew back to the cheering prospect before him, of tasting, at least, a brief respite from the fierce and stormy passions of his mind. Even Ali, who had hastened to obey the Count's summons, went forth from his master's presence in charmed amazement at the unusual animation and pleasure depicted on features ordinarily so stern and cold, while as though dreading to put to flight the agreeable ideas hovering over his patron's meditations, whatever they were, the faithful Nubian walked on tiptoe towards the door, holding his breath, lest its faintest sound should dissipate his master's happy reverie. It was noon, and Monte Cristo had set apart 1 hour to be passed in the apartments of Haydée, as though his oppressed spirit could not all at once admit the feeling of pure and unmixed joy, but required a gradual succession of calm and gentle emotions to prepare his mind to receive full and perfect happiness, in the same manner as ordinary natures demand to be inured by degrees to the reception of strong or violent sensations. The young Greek, as we have already said, occupied apartments wholly unconnected with those of the Count. The rooms had been fitted up in strict accordance with Oriental ideas. The floors were covered with the richest carpets Turkey could produce. The walls hung with brocaded silk of the most magnificent designs and texture, while around each chamber luxurious divans were placed, with piles of soft and yielding cushions that needed only to be arranged at the pleasure or convenience of such as sought repose. Haydée had 3 French maids and one who was a Greek. The first 3 remained constantly in a small waiting room, ready to obey the summons of a small golden bell or to receive the orders of the Romaic slave, who knew just enough French to be able to transmit her mistress's wishes to the 3 other waiting women. The latter had received most peremptory instructions from Monte Cristo to treat Haydée with all the deference they would observe to a queen. The young girl herself generally passed her time in the chamber at the farthest end of her apartments. This was a sort of boudoir, circular and lighted only from the roof, which consisted of rose-colored glass. Haydée was reclining upon soft, downy cushions, covered with blue satin spotted with silver. Her head, supported by one of her exquisitely molded arms, rested on the divan immediately behind her, while the other was employed in adjusting to her lips the coral tube of a rich narghile, through whose flexible pipe she drew the smoke fragrant by its passage through perfumed water. Her attitude, though perfectly natural for an Eastern woman, would, in a European, have been deemed too full of coquettish straining after effect. Her dress, which was that of the woman of Epirus, consisted of a pair of white satin trousers embroidered with pink roses, displaying feet so exquisitely formed and so delicately fair that they might well have been taken for Parian marble, had not the eye been undeceived by their movements as they constantly shifted in and out of a pair of little slippers with upturned toes, beautifully ornamented with gold and pearls. She wore a blue and white striped vest, with long open sleeves, trimmed with silver loops and buttons of pearls, and a sort of bodice which closing only from the center to the waist exhibited the whole of the ivory throat and upper part of the bosom. It was fastened with 3 magnificent diamond clasps. The junction of the bodice and drawers was entirely concealed by one of the many-colored scarves whose brilliant hues and rich silken fringe have rendered them so precious in the eyes of Parisian belles. Tilted on one side of her head, she had a small cap of gold-colored silk embroidered with pearls, while on the other a purple rose mingled its glowing colors with the luxuriant masses of her hair, of which the blackness was so intense that it was tinged with blue. The extreme beauty of the countenance that shone forth in loveliness that mocked the vain attempts of dress to augment it was peculiarly and purely Grecian. There were the large, dark, melting eyes, the finely formed nose, the coral lips and pearly teeth that belonged to her race and country. And, to complete the whole, Haydée was in the very springtide and fullness of youthful charms. She had not yet numbered more than 19 or 20 summers. Monte Cristo summoned the Greek attendant and bade her inquire whether it would be agreeable to her mistress to receive his visit. Haydée's only reply was to direct her servant by a sign to withdraw the tapestried curtain that hung before the door of her boudoir, the framework of the opening thus made serving as a sort of border to the graceful tableau presented by the young girl's picturesque attitude and appearance. As Monte Cristo approached, she leaned upon the elbow of the arm that held the narghile, and extending to him her other hand, said, with a smile of captivating sweetness, in the sonorous language spoken by the women of Athens and Sparta, "Why demand permission ere you enter? Are you no longer my master, or have I ceased to be your slave?" Monte Cristo returned her smile. "Haydée," said he, "you well know." "Why do you address me so coldly, so distantly?" asked the young Greek. "Have I by any means displeased you? Oh, if so, punish me as you will, but do not speak to me in tones and manner so formal and constrained." "Haydée," replied the Count, "you know that you are now in France, and are free." "Free to do what?" asked the young girl. "Free to leave me." "Leave you? Why should I leave you?" "That is not for me to say, but we are now about to mix in society, to visit and be visited." "I don't wish to see anybody but you." "And should you see one whom you could prefer, I would not be so unjust. I have never seen anyone I preferred to you, and I have never loved anyone but you and my father." "My poor child," replied Monte Cristo, "that is merely because your father and myself are the only men who have ever talked to you." "I don't want anyone else to talk to me. My father said I was his joy. You style me your love, and both of you have called me my child." "Do you remember your father, Aide?" The young Greek smiled. "He is here, and here," she said, touching her eyes and her heart. "And where am I?" inquired Monte Cristo, laughingly. "You," cried she, with tones of thrilling tenderness, "you are everywhere." Monte Cristo took the delicate hand of the young girl in his, and was about to raise it to his lips, when the simple child of nature hastily withdrew it and presented her cheek. "You now understand, Aide," said the Count, "that from this moment you are absolutely free, that here you exercise unlimited sway, and are at liberty to lay aside or continue the costume of your country, as it may suit your inclination. Within this mansion you are absolute mistress of your actions, and may go abroad or remain in your apartments as may seem most agreeable to you. A carriage awaits your orders, and Ali and Mirtho will accompany you whithersoever you desire to go. There is but one favor I would entreat of you." "Speak." "Guard carefully the secret of your birth. Make no allusion to the past, nor upon any occasion be induced to pronounce the names of your illustrious father or ill-fated mother." "I have already told you, my lord, that I shall see no one." "It is possible, Aide, that so perfect a seclusion, though conformable with the habits and customs of the East, may not be practicable in Paris. Endeavor, then, to accustom yourself to our manner of living in these northern climes, as you did to those of Rome, Florence, Milan, and Madrid. It may be useful to you one of these days, whether you remain here or return to the East." The young girl raised her tearful eyes towards Monte Cristo as she said with touching earnestness, "Whether we return to the East, you mean to say, my lord, do you not?" "My child," returned Monte Cristo, "you know full well that whenever we part, it will be no fault or wish of mine. The tree forsakes not the flower falls from the tree." "My lord," replied Haydée, "I never will leave you, for I am sure I could not exist without you." "My poor girl, in 10 years I shall be old, and you will be still young." "My father had a long white beard, but I loved him. He was 60 years old, but to me he was handsomer than all the fine youths I saw." "Then tell me, Haydée, do you believe you shall be able to accustom yourself to our present mode of life?" "Shall I see you?" "Every day." "Then what do you fear, my lord?" "You might find it dull." "No, my lord. In the morning I shall rejoice in the prospect of your coming, and in the evening dwell with delight on the happiness I have enjoyed in your presence. Then, too, when alone, I can call forth mighty pictures of the past, see vast horizons bounded only by the towering mountains of Pindus and Olympus. Oh, believe me, that when 3 great passions, such as sorrow, love, and gratitude, fill the heart, ennui can find no place." "You are a worthy daughter of a Pyrrhus, Haydée, and your charming and poetical ideas prove well your descent from that race of goddesses who claim your country as their birthplace. Depend on my care to see that your youth is not blighted, or suffered to pass away in ungenial solitude, and of this be well assured, that if you love me as a father, I love you as a child." "You are wrong, my lord. The love I have for you is very different from the love I had for my father. My father died, but I did not die. If you were to die, I should die too." The Count, with a smile of profound tenderness, extended his hand, and she carried it to her lips. Monte Cristo, thus attuned to the interview he proposed to hold with Morrel and his family, departed, murmuring as he went these lines of Pindar: "Youth is a flower of which love is the fruit. Happy is he who, after having watched its silent growth, is permitted to gather and call it his own." The carriage was prepared according to orders, and stepping lightly into it, the Count drove off at his usual rapid pace. pace. And that concludes today's reading. Tomorrow we'll read 2 more chapters. We'll find out what happens with the Morel family. I love the Morel family. I like when he's playing good fairy godfather instead of avenging angel. So let's see what happens tomorrow in our continued readings from the Count of Monte Cristo. Thank you very much for joining me today, and I'll see you next time. Bye.